Today I'm going to focus on how and where to focus to get the sharpest images possible. And I'm going to be short and I'm going to be to the point of focus. All right, let's get right to the point. But before we talk about where to focus, let's talk about how to focus. Manual versus auto, and there's a couple different schools of thought here. But the one thing about manual focusing is that you can take your lens and you can go back and forth with focus until you get that image pinpoint sharp. So out of focus, in focus, boom, pinpoint. And that way you know, you're certain that you've got focus nailed. Now, the downside about manual focus is in low light. It's very difficult to manually focus your lens. And yeah, if it's real dark, you can find a star maybe and just kind of go back and forth till you get that star pinpoint sharp, or use a good flashlight, shine that on your subject so that you can get focus. But that's one thing about manual focus that I really don't like. I'm primarily a low light shooter, so it makes it difficult to manually focus. Plus, another concern is how well do you trust your eyes? And so, yeah, you want to have a good diopter in your viewfinder. Another reason I like viewfinders. And yeah, you can zoom in 100% in your image, put your glasses on, check focus. You can do all of that. But there's another school of thought, and that's autofocus. So the thing about autofocus is if I can find an area of contrast, a light and a dark, I can kind of pinpoint that with my autofocus and lock on. And I am sure that I've got good focus. And I can capture an image and I can zoom in also and check for sharpness on the back of my LCD. So honestly, I prefer autofocus as opposed to manual focus, and primarily because I'm a low light shooter. But there's just two different schools of thought on that, and whatever works for you, that's the way you should focus. So select auto or manual first. So the next thing to think about, and this is important, how much of your image do you want to be in focus? And you have to think about that. Do you want your foreground in focus with the background? Do you want to blur the foreground? So you have to think about depth of field. So your depth of field is important to understand, so that you understand what's going to be in focus, so that when you get back in post-processing, you're not disappointed. One of the things that I use to really understand my depth of field is I use a depth of field calculator, and I'll leave a link to that in the video description. And I really like this app. It's super great for determining your depth of field. And of course, depth of field varies based on your focal length. And that's another thing. You might want to check out my video on the best focal length for landscape photography, and I'll leave links to that in the end of the video as well. But once you understand your depth of field, then you've got a really good idea of where to focus. And I think that's really important to keep in mind. All right, so once you have your depth of field figured out, then you might have an idea of what all you want to be in focus. And if you want as much of the image, and that seems to be today, everybody wants everything pin sharp, foreground to background, pin sharp. So you might have, and focus stacking, that's a whole nother subject. We can talk about that another day. But if you want to get the most of your image in focus, there's a good rule that I think it's a very good idea, and it's a very good rule, and it does result in it results in better images or sharper images, and that's focusing a third of the way into the scene. So when you're looking out into the scene, you want to focus about a third into the frame. And what that'll do is that'll give you an acceptably sharp image of most of what's in the foreground and the background. So it's a good balance between the foreground and the background. Now, the way I prefer to do it is to use the hyperfocal distance. And again, I mentioned that app that I use, because you really used focal distance on a chart, or we really used it on a lens. Some of the lenses back in yesteryears had hyperfocal distances on the lens that you could use to judge hyperfocal distance. And if you don't know what the hyperfocal distance is, it's really easy. It's you focus to a particular point. Let's just say you focus to 50 feet, and that's the hyperfocal distance. So what that does for you is that gets everything from half of the hyperfocal distance, so 25 feet in, all the way to infinity in acceptably sharp focus. Now, acceptably sharp, basically that's viewing an 8x10 image hanging on a wall at about 3 feet distance. So at least that's my definition. There's some different schools of thought on that. But the point is, the hyperfocal distance is a better way of having a better understanding of what's going to be reasonably sharp in your image. Now, anybody can pixel peep, and if you want to zoom in to 200%, you want everything super sharp, but you might want to be prepared to do some focus stacking. So yeah, if you've got a foreground and a background, and focal length has a big part of that, so that depth of field is huge. But anyway, a good depth of field calculator can really help you in figuring out where to focus and how to focus. Well, there's a couple other things I should mention. Your technique is one. If you, especially if you have a real shallow depth of field, if you focus on an object and then you move around, or you're unsteady, you're not going to get the sharpest image, and it's going to look like your focus is off. But in fact, your technique is important. So just something to keep in mind. So just to sum this up, think about manual focus and autofocus, and I recommend practicing both so that you're ready for any given situation and you know how to focus in either way. And I think that's what's important. Also, keep in mind what is your subject, and focus on the subject. You know, if everything's out of focus but your subject, at least you come away with something. So decide whether you're going to shoot a third of the way into the scene, or maybe you're going to use hyperfocal distance, but I really recommend getting a depth of field calculator and experimenting a little bit so that you can decide which way you want to go. But above all, get your camera, get out, and enjoy yourself. And you know what? Maybe you come away with an image, maybe you don't, but at least you'll be out and enjoying yourself and having a good time. So, well, that's it. But if you like this video, make sure you hit that like button and consider subscribing to the channel. And if you do subscribe, hit that bell icon so you're notified of any future videos that I post. And as always, if I don't see you down the road, maybe I'll see you on the trail.